And we can erase them if you want. All right. Welcome, everybody, to a new session of Rick, Rabbi, and Rebbe, where we talk about the Torah portion of the week with some of the commentaries, not the least, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's, dotting it all together, connecting it all together. So this week's parsha is Emor. It starts off where the Moshe is told to tell the kohen family, the kohanim, that they have to be careful with the impurity laws. They can't touch a body, to the point of even a kohen is not allowed to go to a funeral, besides for his very close relatives, immediate family. And a kohen gadol, the big kahuna, the holiest of the kohen, the leader of the kohanim, he can't even do that. So that talks about that. It talks about some other ideas where a kohen is limited who they can marry, which is interesting, that the idea of a kohen cannot marry a divorcee, as an example. And we then go into some of the holidays. We talk about, and this is one of the places of the Torah where it talks about the source of each of the holidays, Passover and so on, and ends off with a story of a guy who blasphemes. So that's the parsha in a nutshell. And Rick, what did you notice from the parsha?
Well, there were many things to notice in this week's parsha. I mean, it's fascinating to read about all of the information during the temple times of how the holidays and the festivals are formed and what the meaning of them are. But I had some questions that are more specific. One has to do with the priestly class, and it is, why is it so important to maintain an absolute purity, which is what they're talking about as they start defining the priestly class and what they do and how they do it. Well, why is it so important to have an absolute purity of the priestly class? And we don't have such distinctions in purity today. We don't have class structure. And then does that affect how we pray in the 21st century?
So is the question like, why is there a kohen versus a non-kohen? Or is the question?
I think, they were very specific about who could marry who and whether, it could be, and the children. And, in other words, there seemed to be like a significant lineage that they wanted to create, which I understand, the lineage of Aaron, I got it. But, why that absolute purity? And then yet today we do have people who we call to the Torah for Aliyah, who are kohanim, levites, Yisrael, right? We don't really have a class structure per se, but I'm wondering, how does that affect us in the 21st century?
I mean, we don't have the class structure because we don't have a temple. Meaning the class structure was in regard to the service of the Beit HaMikdash. We don't have Beit HaMikdash, so what are you left with? A kohen that gets the first aliyah, like he gets some a little bit of, prominence, but his main function was temple based. So you just don't have that. Mashiach will come, there'll be a temple, the kohanim will be back to their position, the Levites their positions.
So I guess my question goes more to the heart of anybody can be a kohanim. They could just say they're a kohanim, right? I mean, we knew who the kohanim were in the temple period.
I was saying today, if somebody
today, right? Today somebody could, I don't know why they would want to just say they are if they aren't, but
it's very interesting. There's this is sort of like that, but if somebody says they're Jewish, they arrive and they say they're Jewish. How do we know? We don't require. What do we require? So the same question, if someone says they're a kohen and they go to shul, do they get called up as an aliyah? Do we say, oh, show me your documents? Like, we don't.
Right.
Now, the answer is, I think, because we don't, there's no big loss if we say, get your first aliyah. Like, okay, fine. He duchens. there's no big like damage, worst case. So he shouldn't have got that. Okay. Now, the place where it could become a huge problem is in marriage. As you see in this week's Torah portion, talks about Kohen cannot marry a divorcee.
Right.
A Kohen can only marry a widow or a non-married woman. And it's interesting. A Kohen also is not supposed to marry a convert. Interesting. People know that. And so important, wherever there's some Kohen is extra prohibitions, in other words. So it's interesting, many times it's actually, you can only, if someone's a Kohen, they're only bringing potential problems on themselves and their kids, who they can marry, and there's a few more limitations. So it's actually, if someone isn't sure they're a Kohen, it's really not in their interest. They have nothing to gain by being a Kohen. They only have potential problems. So, we will. You say you're a Kohen, okay? You can make yourself a Kohen to limit yourself and have these extra limitations. But that's your problem. Like if you want to do that, like if you are, you are, and if you're not, why you're just adding this extra layer for no reason.
So does it really affect the way we pray in the 21st century? Does it really have an effect on us? In other words, is there?
Is the Kohen a relevant player today?
I guess maybe it's a better way of putting it. Maybe you're right about that. Is the relevance?
Excellent question. Is the Kohen a relevant? Like, I'm trying to think offhand. What's a Kohen good for today? What can they do? They can do the priestly blessing.
Okay.
Something. They get first right of Aliyah, first right of leading Birchat HaMazon. I'm trying to think I'm missing anything else out. That's what they get. What their restrictions are, they can't go to a cemetery.
Right.
And they have some extra marriage restrictions. So that's what a Kohen is. What do they benefit? I can't think offhand, other than the priestly blessing, what the Kohen does today that changes. Like I want to actually point out, the priestly blessing is a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
How do I know it's a big deal? Because if you ever notice in the diaspora, we only do the priestly blessing by holiday. Shabbos. In Israel, they do it every Shabbos, I believe. But this is the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad leader in 1800, big mystic. He actually wanted to reinstate the daily or weekly, I forget, priestly blessing, because he said it's such a incredible power boost. Again, this is all in the back end. I don't know how this works. It does such incredible things for the Jewish people, mystically, however that translates into, that he really wanted to reinstate it. And he was a great halachaist, and he was looking for ways. Bottom line is he didn't, for certain reasons, unbeknownst to us. He chose not to, whatever considerations. But his heart was that you're asking what's a Kohen good for. This is a pretty big deal. The priestly blessing, I can tell you, on the authority of the Alter Rebbe, it's a big deal. It's a very special thing. Beyond that, I'd say we're left with many temple era realities that while we don't have a temple, we don't experience them physically, in a physical sense, but the spiritual concept never ended. So if a Kohen, it says a Kohen was always an ish chesed. I'm just thinking back in the temple. Kohen, what did the Kohen do in the temple times? So they were in the temple. They did the sacrifices. They did the priestly blessing. They also, by the way, were the ones by the leper, by the tsaras. They were the ones that had to declare if this is the spirit, the leprosy, or the skin disease or not, which would make you impure or not. It had to be a Kohen, and the reason given for a Kohen is that Kohanim, for some genetic reason, as being descendants of Aaron, have a certain, I don't know the right word, epigenetics of kindness. And therefore, only a kind person like a kohen, because the one that can declare someone an impure mitzorah, a leper. So maybe that gene, that kindness, is something that kohanim bring today, albeit not officially. I will say, I'm just thinking offhand this question. The Rebbe, whenever people would come by dollars to get $1 from the Rebbe, to meet the Rebbe, and he would empower them. You're my messenger for charity. Here's your $1. But a lot of times, you see on the video, there's hundreds of hours of this recorded, maybe thousands. I mean, there's a video of myself going by, and me and another 100,000 people. But the Rebbe always tell you, you're a kohen, you have the power to bless. That's like the Rebbe, like the way the Rebbe's 5-second interaction with a kohen many times is, you're a kohen, you have the power to bless.
But we're not all kohani.
Oh, so you're asking what we started with. What's a kohen good for? What do they do?
Yeah, okay. The relevance of it. I got
What's
it.
the relevance? So I'm saying today I can't think that much other than the priestly blessing. Now your next question is, why doesn't every Jew have that opportunity? Right?
Yeah, because we're not in temple times, so we don't have the sacrifice, we don't have the altar, and we could all have those same spiritual attributes and be kohanim, right?
By the way, you're in very good company, and that, really we have to start I have to prepare the sources and bring it up on the screen to show people I'm not making this up. But in the end of the laws of Shemitah and Yovel, I believe, of Rambam. So Rambam canonized the whole Jewish law first time, took all the laws from the transcripts of Talmudic discussion and made a systematic law book called Mishnah Torah. I think at the end of his laws of Shemitah and Yovel, he talks about that. He says this law. This is not like an ethical book. This is a law book. Just to that preface, and he says, not only is a levite or a kohen, I mean, not only the tribe of Levi have these abilities to be Levites. Spiritually, everybody can be a Levite. The Rambam says this.
I like that.
Let's break it down. What's a Levite and a Kohen is a more exclusive class of Levites, right? In the same, basically, they're the spiritual leadership of the Jewish people. The Levites are a much larger number. The Kohanim are a little smaller, going from one family of the Levites, but they're spiritual leaders, right? In the temple, they did the spiritual service, but they represent spiritual leadership. Not only that, it was spiritual leadership totally devoted to this. They had no land. You understand? It's biblical law that Levites did not have land. Levites / Kohanim did not have land. They couldn't have land. Every other tribe had land to farm. The Levites did not have a plot of land. What did they get? They got 48 cities of residency, but no plots of land. Why? Because their job is to serve the Jewish people and serve God. It's a spiritual service. It's not like a side hustle. It's like that's what they do.
That was their job.
All the gifts. It's not like, it's literally, we're basically not going to take a path of commerce or agriculture. We're going to dedicate ourselves to the community. The community has to support the Levites in order to, and it's biblically set up that way. But I'm saying that, and therefore the Rambam, he points out, and it's a law book. It's not, because the Rambam sometimes he throws in a thing, you're like, how is this law? But it is law. Everybody can be a Levite of that special priestly class in concept. What's the concept? Total dedication to God's will, not getting caught up in I think his words are in the vanities of time, the temporal stuff, and really dedicating themselves to that.
So we say we are a kingdom of priests and a holy people. And to me, that means we are all that, right?
In the general sense, and even in the particulars I just mentioned of any Jew that wants to up their service and saying, I no longer am going to be concerned with myself. I'm going to dedicate myself to the Jewish people entirely. Every Jew can do that. And thereby be, even post-temple times, not a Kohen that they get the Kohen right, because that's, for whatever reason, we'll talk about it soon, that's still reserved for the Kohanim. But the concept, what's the reward of being a Kohen? It's to be a servant of God in a certain way. You can have that. So total throwing yourself to God's will to the point of relying on God's going to have to take care of me. Obviously, you don't not get a job, but we're saying your mind is so focused on I want to point out here, even more radical, the Rebbe mentioned, and like everything the Rebbe did could be at one point so radical, but also so sourced in text and tradition. But he just pointed out, the Rebbe said about this Rambam, this quote of Rambam, anybody can be a conceptual levite / Kohen by serving the community and not being involved in the temporal stuff of life overly. It doesn't apply to Jews only. Even a non-Jew could do it, because it doesn't say a Jew, it says any person. Because the Rambam is a very vague way. There is this, perhaps that's including a non-Jew can decide to become this sort of conceptual, uttered servant Kohen style, which is crazy.
And what's interesting is that in this parsha is also the discussion of Sukkot and the idea of the myrtle and the palm, and and the four elements, and the idea of I was just trying to find it in the translation. I can't find it right this minute, but it was about those who study Torah, those who don't. They have all kinds of
famous measures that the four species represent the most learned to the least learned Jew.
Yeah. Or then or the most emotional, the most intellectual. But I'm thinking, as we're discussing this about with the spirituality of everybody being a kingdom of priests, right? There's sort of a bookend here, right? I thought that was one of the things that sort of came out to me as I started reading it. It's an interesting concept.
This morning in our daily Chumash Rashi class, there was a Dvar Torah we spoke about today. It's very interesting. It actually ties last week's Torah portion and this week's Torah portion, the mitzvah of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, loving your fellow like yourself,
right?
And the idea of the holidays of the first Jewish month of the year. The first half is high holidays, and the second half is primarily Sukkot and Sukkot
festival,
the Hastara. So in biblical times, our first month was considered the seventh month, because if you're counting Pesach, the beginning, Rosh Hashanah is the seventh month. But whatever the case is, that month is the beginning half is high holidays. The second is the joy of Sukkot and Simchas Torah. It's very interesting. And the Rebbe makes this parallel that to love your fellow like yourself is impossible. Human beings programmed to care about their own preservation more than somebody else. How can you require to love every fellow, even your fellow Jew? Let's say you're to love like yourself. It's kind of like, so the rabbis, they discuss, a lot of them give pragmatic reasons. It means behaviorally treat them to others as if you love them like yourself. You can actually love them, you just behaviorally as if. But the famous chapter 32 of Tanya of the Rabbi Shir Zalman of the Alter Rebbe, he actually says that you could love your fellow like yourself. Well, how? If you spend the time to make your worldview that people are not bodies, but they are souls, and that everything in the world has a soul, people, and God is the engine, or is the energy, the source of everything, and that becomes the real way you look at things. It's easier said than done, but a person can change that. Where things come from somewhere. A body has a spiritual element to it, the soul. And when you change your focus about the spirituality of things, then you start saying the following. Wait a second. I'm a soul. mean, you should actually love yourself, not because of you're good at racquetball and whatever, but you should love yourself because you're a soul, because you're literally a spark of God. You don't have to, there's no qualifying that. You just are. And if you can really buy that and believe that, that means that you have a love for yourself really because of your connection to the eternal, the soul, and that connection to the eternal. Well, if you love yourself as your soul, then your friend's soul, you will also love them the same, because that soul is two steps. One, you both come from the same source.
Right.
It's almost, I gave the parallel of you can maybe relate this loving a sibling. There's a natural love for a sibling because you both come from the same family. It's without details. I mean, they're funny, they're not, those are all details, but there's a natural sibling love just because you come from the same source. So when you look at someone as a soul and you look at yourself as a soul, you say we come from the same source. And therefore you have that sibling, brothership and love. But then there's a second step. We come from the same source, but now we're deep in we're fragmented bodies and stuff.
Right.
But that you think of that actually God specifically wants us to have unity when we're in the fragmented shell of bodies. Why? Because if God wants us in the source, that means there's no transformation of the world. The only way for God to truly, according to the parameters of the world, is to send a soul into the world and a body into the world and into a corner of the world, and millions of these little soul agents of God, and transform little parts of the world collectively. Meaning, you think of, we're one in the source, that's great. But even more, in a sense, we're even more one when we're separated in different bodies and different roles, because now we're accomplishing God's ultimate wish for transforming the world to oneness. Because we become fragmented and we can take a part of the world individually, only through the collective efforts of all of us, you'd say, when are you most in love with your fellow, your sibling, your spiritual brother or sister? You think in the source for one. But in a way, when you're in the body, maybe you're even more one, because then, albeit it's harder, because there's that little facade, but only here are you individually together, achieving God's ultimate wish. So it's either meditation. In other words, to love your fellow yourself, it really takes a lot of meditation. It really means it's really a command of meditation.
Right.
And now I'm going to tie this into Sukkot and to high holidays, because I found this a beautiful tie-in I was reading this morning.
It's a beautiful thought that we're all
high holidays. Just high holidays. So I said there's two steps of the souls: in the source, and then as we are down here separately achieving the same goal. We're interdependently achieving the big goal of God.
Right.
So that parallels the two time periods of the Rosh of Tishrei, of the first month, or the seventh, whatever, the seventh of the first.
Seventh month of the Rosh Hashanah.
The first month, Tishrei. The first month of the holidays, that's all about inwardness. Inwardness, get back into your soul. We move away from the body. We progressively get more in touch with the spirit. On Yom Kippur, we're wearing white. We're dressed like angels. We don't eat. It's literally a soul expression day. The body is very marginal on that day, because we're basically we're living inward on that day, and therefore the soul is all that really matters. That is similar to when you get into the source. right? For loving your fellow, you go back into the source. But we know the goal is not to stay in the source, frolicking in spiritual delight in the source. The goal is to then move it outward, as God does by taking the souls away from their source into fragmented sparks in bodies and transform the world. And that is akin to Sukkot, when you have the four species, which represent the totality of different personalities in the Jewish people, that together, interdependently, they bring a different type of oneness than the original oneness of high holidays. So
that's a beautiful expression of not only loving your neighbor, but also the fact that we are individual sparks. I love that idea. I think that's it's a much better way.
A Jewish law. It's a Jewish law that you should give a lot of tzedakah or do acts of kindness that first month, because it's kind of the same methodology of coming to God. The same way you need to come to a God view, a soul view, to fulfill the mitzvah of loving your fellow like yourself. It's a two-step process. Do that. That will help you do it on the cosmic level of high holidays and Sukkot, which is about retreat, then attack, or retreat and then conquer.
So I'm going to change gears on you now.
Okay.
Shift gears. And we're going to move a little bit
away.
One
last question. Yeah.
Yeah. That was a good question. And we actually moved it in a place that I thought was very interesting and covered both ends of the parsha, right in the beginning. So in prescribing the length of each festival, I noticed that we're told to observe over a 7-day period. However, this seems different than what we actually do, which is 8 days for certain festivals. So which is the correct observance? As that's the first question I have. And why is there a difference from what God in the Torah says and what we require ourselves to do currently?
This is not a very esoteric question. It's a very historical question.
Yeah, of course.
Basically, there's the mitzvah of Passover and Sukkot is 7 days. That's what it says in this week's parsha. Now, to break down those 7 days, you have the first day is a sabbatical, meaning it's like a Shabbos. You can't do work. And then the last day, the 7th day, is also a Sabbath. You can't do work. In the middle is what we call Chol HaMoed. It's the festival, but you can work. You can do minimal, basic, work that you don't lose your job or whatever. You don't lose money, opportunities. Now, in the historic times of the temple, who made the calendar? How do you know when the first day of anything was? The answer is the Beis Din, the court, had to every month establish, it was a window of 2 days. It could have been the first Rosh Chodesh.
Right.
And they had to wait for a witness to come and say they saw the new moon, and they would question them, and then they would declare it to be. Now, if you lived in Jerusalem, the Jerusalem area, then you would know right away the news, right? They declared today's Rosh Chodesh. Okay, great. That means by the time it comes to the 15th of the month, this is the 15th of the month, because if you're not sure when day 1 is, you don't know when day 15 is, when Passover starts. But if you lived further away, you didn't always have access to that information of what the first day of the calendar month is. So you were kind of in limbo till later in the month. It became clarified through messenger. So many times those people, those places would keep 2 days out of doubt. Is it this day? Did the month start yet or not? And they had to sort of do 2 days in sort of Suffolk out of doubt.
But they're not 2 days of Rosh Chodesh.
Actually, back then there was usually one. Sometimes there was the equivalent of 2 days of Rosh Chodesh. There was
really?
Actually. But it was for a technical reason, because if the messenger came after a certain time point, then they couldn't declare Rosh Chodesh, but they kept it in case. They would keep it hoping it would be Rosh Chodesh. If the guy didn't come till a certain time, they couldn't thereby declare Rosh Chodesh because they missed the opportunity for the Rosh Chodesh offering. but they would sort of just end it. Okay, we'll keep it as a Rosh Chodesh, but tomorrow will be real Rosh Chodesh. So there was kind of like a precedent of 2 days of Rosh Chodesh. But I'm saying even without that, if you lived further away, you didn't know when. Let's say it was 1 day Rosh Chodesh. You didn't know when they declared that 1 day.
Right.
So you had to keep 2 days of holidays sort of in limbo till you found out, okay, it was really the first day of the holiday was the real day, or the second day was the real day.
So basically in Jerusalem, they celebrated 7 days based on the prescription.
Jerusalem or parts of,
but in other
or
parts of Israel, they actually had 8 days.
I believe parts of
Unless
Israel,
they started late. I mean, maybe they started late because they didn't have the word, and that's possible too. And they still only celebrated 7 days, was just off a little bit, right? It's just
so now we today, but at a certain point in history, this should be irrelevant because
right.
Hillel the elder made a calendar. So we're done with the questionable dates. So the answer to that is the answer to that is that we keep 2 days as a minhag now. Minhag as custom with our forefathers.
Yeah, custom of your community.
And anticipation of Mashiach, when places outside Israel will go back to that Rosh Chodesh model. Now we have communication, so I don't know, we'd still be able to find it pretty quickly. But we keep it as minhag to the way things were done. Because it's not a bad thing to keep a second day. It's just, if you don't have to, you don't. And a lot of minhagim that became added through diaspora are kind of like where, man's beauty touches of Judaism and the law, man gives some final extra strokes. So we're very careful not to take away minhag without very certain parameters.
But the minhag is not actual law; it's just custom that we've followed over the ages.
But at a certain point, precedent, even custom, becomes law. There's a certain idea that minhag Yisrael, the minhag of the Jewish people, Torah, becomes a law, and that's because it becomes a collective vow that we do, and it's not easily abrogated, I guess.
So I guess the question is, if somebody celebrates only 7 days, I'm asking this question. If somebody only celebrates 7 days, which is the prescription in the Torah, and others celebrate 8 days, is there a difference in their observance? In other words, is there
in Israel versus here?
Of the person celebrating 7 as opposed to 8, or are they still completing the obligation of celebrating the holiday?
I mean, the idea of rabbinic law is that we believe that if that place of diaspora or part of Israel would be keeping 8 days, that becomes the requirement. 7 days in Israel is the same. Is the same. They're doing what's for them.
Right.
It's not like we're better than Israel because we do 8, they do 7. It's each one has its own needs, and therefore the custom or the practice developed accordingly.
Yeah, because I know that my friends in Israel celebrate only 7 days.
Right.
We celebrate 8.
Right.
I
think, look, this is to believe that Jewish destiny. Again, a lot of the history that happens and the customs that we did as sort of depending on time and place, really are part of God's wish. God didn't want here's the manual. God wanted minhag to be developed, and there became parameters how to do a minhag and make it canonized, so to speak. So it's
okay.
Anyways, all right, well, good Shabbos, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Shabbos, Rabbi, and we'll see you next week.